Oh hell, internet, identity, ought to be fun. So I am going to characterize myself as being on the fence here again, but I want to be quite clear. The conservative right is causing this problem with, I think, some extremely childish objections to the idea of the rights of alternative genders and sexualities. Now, to accept the existence of a full range of alternative genders and sexualities to me seems so uncontroversial at this point, I find it ridiculous that it's even an issue. If you choose to live in the modern world, which if you were seeing this, you do, no one is asking you to change the way you personally behave. And yes, maybe there is a chance that some of your children will decide to embrace an alternative lifestyle where they wouldn't have before. Too bad. Gender identity has always ranged broadly. And let me offer the right an olive branch here, though. If you want, you can still think of them as freaks. It turns out that, alternative sexualities seem to make up roughly 2% of the population, around about that number. So you can still think of them as freaks. It just happens to be that freaks can live a satisfying and valid life too. Who knew? And perhaps even create new forms in the world which will enrich and satisfy your life further. And certainly already have done just that. If any of the queer community find offence in the word freak, then just remember one person's freak is another's unique. And if anyone found a problem in the word alternative gender, what about indie gender? As always, the words don't matter, it is the intent. Many in the centre say this, and we still get called out as prejudiced. Why? I have no answer to that. So, I have had relatively little reason to think about gender, and yet I have. I would say my gender identity has varied a little over time, but it was also never really that important to me. I saw that all identities were becoming increasingly accepted, and so I assumed that all I really required was a sense of me. I think there's been a backlash, though. Am I wrong about that? I feel like we did get closer to genuine acceptance, and there's been some kind of backlash. The right may say that this is as a result of woke culture gone mad. The left may say that maybe the bigotry and prejudice was just buried deep. I don't know, but I do know that the general trend is still in the direction of greater acceptance, and there is still a lot of bigotry and prejudice in the world. You cannot deny that. However, there are some fights that really don't need to be fights. Some hills you don't need to die on. For example, can I not just say trans women are trans women? Thinking about J.K. Rowling's recent comments, yeah, she's throwing her weight around. She's rich, and why do we care about her opinion on this subject? All of that is true. But I want to explore some nuance here. The biology of reproduction is not wholly binary, of course, but can we say that it is mostly binary to a first approximation? As I understand it, the gender spectrum relies on a finite list of genes and a finite list of possible genetic combinations. The more that this list expands, then the more of a spectrum the gender spectrum genuinely becomes. But correct me if I'm wrong, the current idea of the gender spectrum means it's more of a gender spectroscopy, where there are defined peaks in the possible range of genetic outcomes. This is not meant in bad faith, but may be taken as such, I don't know. But the pride flag represents all identities, but yellow is not green, purple is not blue. It is a spectrum, and I really do believe in the potential for infinite diversity, but only because there is a difference in the first place between infrared and ultraviolet. At least that's the way I see it. There is more to say, of course, but let's move on. I live in Thailand, which is a country which I think it's fair to say leads the world in trans rights. There is a wide range of normative gender identities here. I'm not going to claim that it is perfect. There is still prejudice. And I'm not going to claim that, oh, I know because I have loads of trans friends. I have a few trans acquaintances, but I'm an introvert in their 40s. I don't make so many new friends these days, you know? That aside, there's lots I don't know about the so-called trans experience, and, I'm open to understanding that more. But the widespread acceptance of trans people in Thailand does not seem to be historic. As far as I can tell, it's only come about since the 70s and the beginning of the Pride era. One thing that hasn't changed is ID cards. Your birth gender will appear on your ID card no matter what you do. So Thailand has mostly gone to the existence of trans people, and trans people in Thailand have mostly gone to the way that society chooses to characterize them. Like I said, there is still prejudice against them, and there is actually a changing ID card movement, and that will probably happen at some time in the future. But why is Thailand such a comparative haven for trans people? It's been suggested to me that it's something to do with an accepting Buddhist mindset, and this does make sense, but it doesn't explain why only Thailand has taken this approach, and to a lesser extent the Philippines, which is not a Buddhist country. I've asked a number of people, but there seems to be no consensus. One thing we can clearly say to the conservatives is that Thailand clearly demonstrates that social life does not disintegrate when you allow a broad range of identities. Fucking obviously. Let's just piggyback off the ID card issue for a fun side note. If we're going to talk administrative pronouns, how about this? Your ID will have a 4 to 5 digit code which starts XX or XY. That distinction exists in the majority for whatever reason and to whatever extent. Now there is a grey area, and that's why a 4 or 5 digit personal pronoun would be both more diverse and more medically useful. One place it would fall down is on pronunciation, although pleasingly it might come quite close to the ones that have already been suggested, the kind of j sound. However, this is a flippant idea, and I don't propose it seriously. When it comes to he versus she, which does not exist in all languages, I think presentation is, broadly speaking, the best criteria. We could get further into the weeds here and the very thorny issue of bathrooms, but let's not right now. Look, I know anything I say in this video can be cast as mansplaining. There is no such thing as mansplaining, okay? Condescension is condescension, but I don't want to be doing that either. There is much I do not know, and I'm at the base level still saying that a greater diversity of individuals is hugely important in the modern mass society, and I want those individuals to be able to get into places where their diversity of thought makes a difference. But at this point in history, I think we also have to accept transphobes are part of diversity. Everyone is affected by their genetics and their environment. This is true of prejudiced people, this is true of trans people. If you are a trans person watching this, I'm sure you've experienced much prejudice in your life, and some of that prejudice has had an effect on your personality. It has not created your personality or your identity, but it will have affected it. I am not a gay man. I know this to be true, but I'm also very comfortable with the fact that in certain other realities I am, because I would describe myself as bi-curious to some extent. But for some other life experiences, I would be living a different life. This does not mean that what life I live is only as a result of my life experiences, not at all. But it's a bit like saying, you know, the nature of a sports fan does not consist in whether they end up liking football or martial arts. To conclude my thoughts, the idea that any minority will want their identity to be accepted as a thing in itself is entirely understandable, or else how can you be able to recognize that minority as valid? You can't accept trans people if you don't believe they exist. But there it is, the linguistic paradox of identity. You know, true equality is achieved precisely when trans people are in no way special, and they are simply people in the population of the mass individual. But this goal is actually opposed by the idea of the identity as a definition. A cup of glitter can be held in the bath and the water not rush in, and thus it can maintain its identity as a cup of glitter, but it must be dispersed throughout the water if it is truly to make the whole more sparkly. But let me repeat my disclaimer. It's the conservatives who created the cup which holds trans people separate, and created the inherent animosity in the relationship. And they did this out of an old-fashioned tribal mindset that is not compatible with the modern mass society. So I give every license to people to define their own trans experience. But what I would suggest, and tell me if you think I'm wrong, is that there is no such thing as the trans experience. Again, the Tao that can be spoken is not the universal Tao.